Okay, hey, welcome to our next safe tool operation video. This one's going to be about the table saw. That's what this tool is called. And there's a safety first information sheet here beside it telling you some of the very important things to remember about using the table saw. Eye protection, earplugs, remove all the jewelry and loose clothing that confine your long hair. Okay, tie my hair back here. Operate with guards in place. So these are guards. They have to be in place. If there are a few cuts where you have to remove the guards, but if you don't remove the guards without getting permission to do so, always use a fence or a miter gauge. Never stand directly in line with the table saw. So I'm in line here. Okay. There's a few reasons for that. I'm going to go over how you're going to operate this machine. So it's called a table saw because there's a big flat table here that supports the material. And it's called the saw because there's a saw blade poking up through this area in the top of the table. There's a dial on the front here. Maybe come around and you'll see that. A dial right here that changes the height of the blade. You can see the blade moving up and down there as I'm spinning this handle. There's also one on this side, and what that does is it tilts the blade to give you a different angle. Okay, as you spin this, you can see the blade tilting. Okay, and it'll bottom out when it's at 90 or square. Okay, that's good. While you're here, take a look here. This is how you turn it on and off. You pull this out to start it, push it in to stop it. Okay. The handy thing about this switch being there is if you're in the middle of a cut and something isn't going right, you can bump it with your knee to shut it off and you don't have to remove your hands from the material. One of the main purposes of a table saw is to rip boards, to cut them along the grain like this. And the table saw is used mainly as a ripping tool for changing the width of material. To do that, you have to use a fence, and the blade does the cutting. The distance between the fence and the blade is what determines the size of your cut. For example, if I want to have a piece that's that big, okay, I want to set my fence on this edge of the board so that my blade will cut here, and I'll end up with the piece I want. So I'm going to remove the guard just so you guys can see clearly. So I'm changing the fence and I'm setting it here to be lined up with the blade. And now everything I send through there is going to be the same size. Okay? That's how it works. There is a measuring guide right here with a measuring tape and a little red line that shows you the size of that cut, the distance between the blade and the fence. Okay. It's a pretty common mistake for people to figure that they have to, what's left over out here is the piece they want, and they can get a little confused by trying to measure and move it so that the piece that's left over is the size they want. It's not how it works. You want the piece between the blade and the fence, that's the piece you're after. All right? You'll notice there's a handle back here that you raise to unlock the mechanism, and you can move the fence back and forth. Push that down and it locks the fence in place. Okay, let's see what else I got here. You have to keep your fingers at least 4 inches from the blade at all times. This tool has a 4-inch margin. Okay. Before turning on the table saw, how high should you set the blade? You can see that I can change the blade height. I want to set it about the thickness of a pencil above. So about there, okay? Or you could also look at the bottom of the teeth, right down at the bottom, that gullet. It's called a gullet, this little gap here. Right at the bottom there is about as high as you want it to be. Okay, so right there is pretty good. That's good. You want to make sure you have the guards in place before you use this saw. And this is the guard. There's a few things to the guard. Okay, we got the guard. This is called a splitter, and these right here are anti-kickback teeth. So as a board goes through here, those sharp teeth will catch so you can't pull the board back. You see how it's grabbing in here? You can't pull the board back here now. And that's important because the two main risks that you have with the table saw are cutting yourself, obviously, the blade is spinning, but also what can happen is the board can get caught in between the blade and the fence and bind on the blade and cause what's called kickback, where it can send the piece flying backwards really quickly. So these anti-kickback teeth prevent that from happening, as well as the splitter prevents the wood from closing in on the blade, which causes it to pinch. That doesn't generally happen, but if a piece has a bit of tension in it or is wet, it will tend to close in around the cut. As you cut through, it'll close and grab on the blade and can send it flying backwards. That's why it's important when you're cutting to stand to the side like this when you're cutting, so you're out of the trajectory of that kickback zone, what do you call it. Okay. So it's important when you're using cutting a piece of wood on the table saw that it's already flat and straight. Okay, it can't be really warped, because warped, if the material is too twisted or cupped, it can cause it to shift during the cut and bind on the blade, and that could cause a kickback. So it has to be flat and straight. Okay. And you also have to keep the material flat on the table. You never want to be holding it up in the air like this, trying to cut. It has to be flat on the table and tight to the fence. Always tight to the fence. So that being said, you never try to go freehand like this. The fence has to be used. You can't try to guide this piece of wood through the blade without having a fence guiding it. The material should always be against the fence as you push through. Okay. If you have to push the material through and your hand is passing closer than 4 inches, you have to use a push stick. All right, push stick enables you to keep your fingers clear of that blade, and you can push that material all the way through. Let's see, what else do we have here? So when you're ripping on the table saw, the material must be fed all the way through until it clears the blade. It has to, when you have your cut, you can't stop it halfway through. Because once the blade actually does the cut, you have to continue pushing it all the way through until it's clear of the blade. Okay? The other thing you never do is let go of the piece when it's halfway through your cut. If you let go, then that thing is free floating. It could come flying back at you. You have to maintain control of this piece all the time. Okay? Once you're done the cut, instead of reaching over like this to grab the material, you always have to walk around. Okay? Always walk around and get the material from this side. Never reach over top where a slip or anything could put you in contact with that blade. Once you're done using this, make sure that you remove any of the cutoffs that you've made and that the machine is not running anymore. Then you can walk away from it. I'll demonstrate how to cut this, taking all those things. So I'm going to get the blade set the right height, make sure my guard is in place, and I'll make a cut here so you can see how it works. I'm going to make a 6-inch cut, so I'm going to set it here at 6 inches, lock it in place, and we're ready to go. Turn it on, open the material, squeeze it in. Right here, I maintain control with this hand, and I grab the push stick. Push it all the way through. Shut off the machine, walk around, and retrieve the material from this side. Alright? One more thing I want to show you about this is where you put the push stick when you're pushing this through. Now this is fairly important because a lot of people will have a table saw in their garage. Most people, for whatever reason, the first thing they do is take the guard off. I'm not sure why. It's something to do with their pride as a woodworker or something, they feel they don't need to have it or they can't see properly. Guard is important to have on there. If you're ever working not in this shop and you're in some situation where there is not a guard on there or a splitter, you have to be aware that you have to keep that material against the fence. And one way for that you get into trouble with that is if you are pushing the material, feeding it through. Imagine this here, and you're pushing at this end. Right here, you can see what's happening to the material when I'm pushing over here. It's starting to drift away from the fence. And that's causing it to turn into the blade and can get caught on that blade and come sending back like a frisbee. That's if you don't have any of this on there, which you may encounter that in your life if you're doing woodworking. So you want to always be aware that this has to be kept against the fence. One way to do that is, instead of putting pressure over here, move the pressure to this side, and then it will push into the fence. That also causes your finger to go closer to the blade than is necessary. So you have to use the push stick, and it stays closer to the blade. Okay? That's a question on the test. I'll demonstrate that. Here, I'm going to put it here. That way, if you're ever in a situation where you're cutting it with a table saw, it doesn't have a splitter or anti-kickback fingers or a guard, you can still cut safely. Because chances are you're going to encounter that in your life. You can either decide just to not use that saw or to do it safely. Because you still can cut safely. It's not recommended. But if you're ever not in this shop, that's a key thing to keep in mind. It has to be against the fence. For now, that's all we're going to go over. So, right on.